Hello, welcome to our Heritage Live. I apologize for the technical problems. We were just informed after we finished our whole presentation that we were not live. I'm sorry, I believe we are live now, so we're going to do it again. I had a good rehearsal, and thanks for sticking with us. So this is just a sneak peek, this Heritage Live, of the exhibit that's coming up, which is about our exhibit that will be called Coquitlam's Heart of Gold, and the exhibit is going to cover some of the topics that were concerned with the settling of Coquitlam, which was connected to the gold rushes that were in the BC. Before we begin, I would just like to just let everyone know that Coquitlam Heritage gratefully operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, who continues to live on these lands and care for them, along with the waters and all that is above and below. These lands are also the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Kikite, and Katzie First Nations. And we're happy to be able to operate on their land. So as I said, we are going to have an exhibit at the house here at Mackin House Museum for Coquitlam Heritage, and it's going to run from September 17th until June 2022. And it's going to be about the gold rushes that affected BC. Everybody knows about, well, a lot of people know about the California gold rushes that happened in 1849 when the 49ers crowded out to the west coast to look for gold. But shortly after that, BC also had a series of gold rushes. There was the Haida Gwaii gold rush in 1851. Gold was found at the Nikoman River in 1857, and then in 1858, the Fraser River gold rush really took off. Gold was found and word got out, and miners from California who were no longer getting much gold from their claims flooded up to BC. There were people who came across the country and from all over the world. There were subsequent finds in different areas of BC. At Rock Creek, there was the Caribou Gold Rush up by Barkerville, the Wild Horse River Gold Rush in the Kootenays, and there was also gold found at the Leech River in the mid-early 1860s on Vancouver Island. There was the Big Bend Gold Rush, the Onameka Gold Rush, as well as gold in the Cassiar, Granite Creek, Atlin, and then we finish off the gold rush with the Klondike, which technically is not BC, but a lot of the miners that were here went up there as well. So the gold rushes had quite an impact on Coquitlam. No gold was actually found here, unless you consider the Pit Lake Mystery gold as gold. You can find out about that Pit Lake gold story if you come to the museum. But the sudden influx of miners from California led to 23,000 men coming by boat, 8,000 coming overland from all over the world, and at risk was law and order in the province, the 49th parallel boundary, which had been established but never surveyed, and the worry that we were going to be annexed by, is that my feet? Sorry, that we were going to be annexed by the US. So the Royal Engineers arrived, and they used existing routes from the First Nations to cross the area to start to lay things out for the miners and for the people that lived in the area. And Coquitlam was also close to lots of transportation routes, primarily ones that were on the water, because of course the Fraser River passed by Coquitlam. But one interesting part about the settling of Coquitlam was the arrival of women. So I have 4 items here with me today to give you a sneak peek at some of the things we're going to talk about in the exhibit, and one of them is this cage for a hoop skirt. So at that time, the hoop skirts were not necessarily the height of fashion, but there was one group of women that used them, and they were called the Hurdy girls. In 1858, there were 5,000 people in the province, and only 20 of them were women. So you can imagine that any women that would arrive would be more than welcome. So that's one of the things that came, is these women called hurdy-gurdy girls. You may not have heard of hurdy-gurdy girls, and you may not have heard of the instrument called a hurdy-gurdy, but we have a picture of one here. The hurdy-gurdy was an instrument that may have come from Spain in the 1100s AD, or it could have come from the Ukrainian Cossacks in early 1600s. Regardless, by the 1820s it was a fairly common instrument in Germany, in the Hessen area. And someone there discovered that if they used the hurdy-gurdy girls to play music at the broom makers in Germany used the hurdy-gurdy girls at market to increase their sales. They figured out if they had a pretty girl there playing music, more people would come to their little booth and they would sell more brooms, and it seemed to work. So this soon became kind of an organized system, and they had promoters that were known as soul merchants because they traded in these girls until it was outlawed in Germany in 1865. Prior to that, these girls were sent all over the colonies and across Europe and used to bring in sales. So it was outlawed in 1865, but by that time the hurdy-gurdy girls had spread to the California gold rush. The 49ers knew them well, and they also came to BC. A lot of them went to Barkerville. So these women would hang out at their establishment with supervisors and chaperones. They were supposed to be good girls. There's some question as to whether or not they involved themselves in any illicit activity or not. But for $1, the miners could have a dance with the hurdy-gurdy girls, and they had a specific way of dancing with them. And you can learn more about that when you come to the museum to see the exhibit. Some of the other women that came to the country side were entertainers and artists. There were business women who set up shop and had roadhouses to accommodate traveling miners and traveling stagecoaches as the roads were built. There were wives and mothers. The Royal Engineers' wives and daughters came. There were gold camp followers, and some of them were miners as well, some of the women. There were also some that were involved in less savory activities. There were also a lot of First Nations women who were involved, and it's safe to say that without their assistance, a lot of the miners would have had a tougher time of it. They worked as cooks, they worked as guides, they worked as packers. Some of them even married miners or lived in common law relationships with them, with varying outcomes, which you may find out more about if you come to see the exhibit. Another thing that brought women to BC were the Brideships. So in England at the time, the Industrial Revolution had set up a fairly unequal social situation. There were a lot of poor women who were either widowed or had children out of wedlock, and they had no place to go. So they were in workhouses or they worked in service, but they were poor and they were a problem. There were a lot of men that had left the colony at the same time because of the economic situation and gone to other colonies. So there were a lot of single women who were having a difficult time of it. So this Columbia Mission Society organized a group that sent out brideships. So they got some of these deserving poor women, they loaded them on ships and they sent them out to BC. There were 4 ships all told. One of them did not arrive with the promised cargo, and 2 of them had very small loads of cargo, speaking of women, and one of them was more successful than the others, and it was the Tynemouth. The Tynemouth had quite a journey. They had mutinies at sea, they had encountered hurricane-level storms, they were closely monitored so they could barely move around the ship because they didn't want them mingling with the crew, and all in all it was a pretty horrible trip. When they arrived, these, I think it was 40 women, and they were met by over 500 miners who had trekked in from all over the countryside in the hopes of finding a woman. So these women, some of them did marry miners, some went into service for the upper class in Victoria, and some married Royal Engineers. There is also evidence that there were some that helped settle Coquitlam, but you can find out more about that if you come and see the exhibit. So I'm going to take down this hurdy-gurdy hoop skirt, which was made for us by one of our staff members, Joelle. She did a nice job. We'll have her on display fully dressed at the exhibit. And the second item I have here is called a surveyor's chain. So as I said, the Royal Engineers were sent out here, and part of the reason they were sent was to help keep law and order with all the rowdy Americans and to solidify the 49th parallel boundary through a survey. But they also spent a lot of time surveying roads and trails so that the miners and the settlers could find their way around the area. So, this is the Gunter's chain. It was used to measure land through surveying, and it was invented by, the chain was invented by a man named Edmund Gunter. He was a clergyman and a mathematician who lived from 1581 to 1626. What is significant about this chain is that it made it easier to measure things from old-timey measurements to a more, to an easier system. So the chain is based on the furlong and the rod. The furlong is basically the amount of territory, the length of land that a team of oxen could plow before they had to have a break. The oxen would then turn around and go back the other way. So that's how land began to be measured quite a long time ago. It's linked to ancient agricultural practices, and it also gives us the term acre. So this is what was used to measure the province of British Columbia and the roads and the surveyed lots. So the chain is 66 feet long. So you can imagine that doing measurements with that number over and over and to with large numbers of chain lengths, that's a difficult number to work with. So the genius of the Gunter chain is that this Edmund Gunter used the length of 66 feet, a furlong, but he divided it into 100 lengths so that it could be used in a decimal system. So each, and let me just get this right here. So there's four 22-foot lengths in a Gunter's chain. It's 66 feet long. An acre is 1 chain wide by 10 chains long. But the chain has these little things on it here, and that indicates 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet, 50, or links. I think it's links. You'll find out exactly if you come and read the sign when I've written it properly. My memory for numbers is not great. And then when you get to the 50, it starts to go down towards the other end so that you end up at the end here. So let's just check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's links. These mark 10 increments of links. So this was quite heavy. It's made out of brass, and it was carried around by the surveyors along with a lot of other equipment, and you'll be able to see some of that equipment and how it, and what it was used for when you come in for the exhibit. And so this is to represent the section of the exhibit that's going to talk about the Royal Engineers. And as I said, they used a lot of the First Nations trails to survey the land. Let's see what I'm missing here. There's also an engineer's chain that was in use, and it was more used for surveying lots of land, and it was 100 feet long, so a little easier to use. Royal Engineers, yeah, and then the Royal Engineers after the Gold Rush, of course, were involved in surveys for the CPR. Some of them were disbanded and went back to Britain. Some went to other places, but many of them stayed and settled in the area. If you've ever traveled on the SkyTrain and you've gone through New Westminster and you come to Sapperton Station, you can see there's a sign on one of the buildings, it's quite large, it says the sappers were here. The Royal Engineers were also known as sappers, and you can find out why when you come in and see the exhibit. So, and they also preempted land, the Crown land. There were a lot of people that preempted land in the area of Coquitlam during the time of the Gold Rush. And when the Royal Engineers were disbanded, they were granted Crown land lots as well. Some of them stayed on them, some of them did not. They sold them off to other people. Now, what else was I going to say about that? Oh yes, and yeah, one of the interesting things about the Royal Engineers is North Road, which runs right through Coquitlam. It was surveyed by the Royal Engineers based on one of the First Nations trails, and the reason that they made that road was because at the time they were worried about the U.S. annexing the territory, and the Royal Engineers were settled in New Westminster, which became the capital of the area, and they were worried that if there was an invasion of Americans, they would be stuck on the riverside with no place to go. So they built North Road so that it could go all the way to the Burrard Inlet, which gave them an out or a way to get supplies in should they have to retreat. So that's one of the reasons North Road is here, linked directly to the Royal Engineers, who are linked directly to the gold rushes. The next thing I have to show you, or things, is a Squadron of Flies. I've put them in this order so that you can imagine the attack. Up. How's that? Can you see them now? They're in squadron formation because I imagine that anyone in the bush at that time would have felt like they were under fire. There was a man named Dr. Cheadle, I forget his first name, but he came across the country. He wasn't a miner, but he came at the time of the gold rush, so that he could get a look at what was going on. And he wrote in his diary, "Fearful amount of gadflies, horses half mad, tormented to death by flies, sandflies and mosquitoes terribly annoying, mosquitoes murderous. I couldn't find any fake mosquitoes, but I did find flies." So you can imagine what it would have been like. They didn't have mosquito nets, they didn't have really very good tents, they lived out in the bush, they didn't have mosquito repellent, unless they were smart enough to talk to the First Nations people and learn from them, but a lot of them just didn't, because they were colonialists and they just didn't think that way. And so couldn't really buy bug repellent, although there were some recipes floating around for that. Some people slept, whether it was hot summer or cold winter, with their entire bodies and faces covered up. So it was pretty miserable. They were just continually pestered by them, flies, or the men and animals alike. You will also find out a little bit about the different kinds of pack animals that were used as a side note. The other thing that was really difficult in the conditions here were the roads, which were non-existent. They were bush trails for the most part, and until the Royal Engineers came. And a lot of people preferred to travel by water. Unfortunately, a lot of them were quite green and they didn't really know how to handle canoes very well. And many people drowned in the Fraser River on their way to the gold camps. And they also fell through ice and met their end that way. All supplies had to be brought in or foraged or hunted. At the beginning of the gold rush, as people traveled up north, there were no places to purchase supplies. And then as the gold rush continued, supplies became very expensive because of the cost of packing them in. General health suffered. The men were undernourished and overworked, and they didn't live a very easy life. And as I said, the landscape was full of fallen trees and swamps and steep climbs, especially on your way up to the Caribou. And then once things did get a little easier and camps were established, they had to contend with fleas. So the next thing that I have to talk about as a introduction to the exhibit that's coming is this. I got a little box here. Can you see that, Amelia? This is what's known as fool's gold. It's not real gold. It's glittery and it looks seductive, but it's way, way lighter than real gold. And it's also not quite the same rich yellow as gold. Fool's gold is actually pyrite. But I brought this out to talk about gold itself because I don't have this much gold in my possession. And this gold, well, what's interesting about the gold is that the miners who were really involved in mining the gold knew the differences of the gold color by area. So they could often look at a color of gold and say, well, that's not from here, it's from there. And the mine at Keithley Creek was an interesting story because this guy found at the mouth of Keithley Creek, and there's another little creek there, I forget the name of, he discovered some gold and he wanted to keep it under his hat with his co-workers, and they didn't want anybody to know about it, so they kept it really, really quiet. But then at some point they had to go into the local town to get some supplies. Unfortunately, they had to pay for those supplies with the gold that they had found. When they went into the store, they paid with the gold. The guy who took their gold was savvy, and he knew that this gold was a different color than any he'd seen previously. He put two and two together, and he realized that this Keithley guy had found a new gold mine, and it couldn't be that far away. So essentially the cat was out of the bag, and they were followed by all these guys who came out and immediately had placer mines on the creek. There were lots of different ways of mining, of gold mining as well. And as efficiency increased, so did the degradation to the local landscape, and it also had detrimental effects on the First Nations, muddying up the water with silt when they used the big sluice boxes and flumes and hydraulics, and disrupting the runs of salmon, and as well as other things in the environment. But the ways that they used to mine the gold, they could do it by rockers, where they would rock this box full of gravel, and the heavy gold would drop to the bottom, which could then be claimed. They used gold pans, a similar sort of thing. You've probably seen pictures of the gold pans. They shuffled them around with gravel and water in them, and the gold would come to the bottom. But then they moved on to bigger and more efficient, well, not more efficient, they moved on to different methods that could handle greater quantities of gravel, like hydraulics and sluice boxes and flumes. And with those methods, they often with those methods, they missed a lot of the tiny little pieces of gold. And this actually had a bearing on the Chinese miners that came in. They were often not among the forefront of miners in the gold creeks, although they did mine up in Barkerville. There's quite a few gold mines that have Chinese owners. But in the case of some of the early mines, after the colonial miners moved on, the Chinese miners would often move in and take over the old claims, and they were able to find the smaller traces of gold that were left behind by some of these methods. So it was an extra thing that they could do, but you can learn a little bit more about some of the Chinese gold miners from the exhibit. So everybody does know about the gold miners. They're pretty well known. They came up with their pans and they hiked up and did the thing, but of pertinence to Coquitlam, there were also Royal Engineers. There was the 49th Parallel Border Commission. There was an influx of Americans. There was bridge and road building. There were overlanders who came, 49ers from California. And there was all the other people who made it work, such as farmers and the native packers, suppliers and laborers. They had to have gold commissioners. They had to have assayers to tell what the worth of the gold was. There were numerous stagecoach companies, lots of businesses and services, and in steamboat companies made a killing, taking people as far as Yale before they headed off into the trails. And as I mentioned, lots of women were involved in the settlement of the area, and without them it probably would have been a lawless place. The Hurdy-Gurdy girls, the Brideship girls, and the wives and daughters of other people that came. And then there were the Chinese laborers and miners, and who eventually went on to help build the CPR, which was then considered a worthwhile endeavor because of the large population that did settle here. So this is just a sneak peek, and we hope that you'll come down to Mackin House Museum on September 17th until the end of, or till the middle of June next year, and have a look at our exhibit about Coquitlam's Heart of Gold and the things that the gold rushes brought with them that affected where we live today. So I think you can ask questions. I'm not sure. If anybody has any questions, I will answer them. If not, I will bid you adieu.
We have one comment. Miggy says hi.
Hi, Miggy. We miss you. No other questions?
The stream just needs to catch up.
Oh, we're just waiting to see if we have any more. You'll be astonished to find out just how heavy gold is if you don't already know. I have plan something here at the museum that will give you an idea of that. I was really shocked how heavy it was. We're still waiting. Looks like we're good, no questions. So thanks for joining us for this Heritage Live, and we look forward to seeing you at Mackin House to find out about Coquitlam's Heart of Gold. Thank you.